Good afternoon and welcome to Haroldopedia, Haroldo de Campos, an international perspective. You are encouraged to send any questions to the panelists through the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen that will be answered at the end of the webinar. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Jackson, professor of Portuguese at Yale, and I'm very happy to welcome all of the panelists and viewers to the program. Haroldopedia, Haroldo de Campos, an international perspective. This event is sponsored by the lecture series of the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies at Yale University, and we want to give special thanks to Asia Nopani and Megan Paluzzi for their organization. The format, after introductions, will be brief descriptions by our participants of their essays and interests in Haroldo de Campos, followed by a question period. I would like to thank all those who have promoted this event, with special thanks to Julia Mendonça at the Casa das Rosas, Haroldo's archive in São Paulo. My co-host today is Professor Eduardo Jorge de Oliveira of the University of Zurich. In 2019, we began our collaboration by co-organizing complementary international conferences at the University of Zurich and Yale on Haroldo de Campos, fortunately a few months before the pandemic. Haroldo de Campos, one of the most distinguished literary personalities of the last half of the 20th century, is author of dozens of books of poetry, criticism, and translation. He called his study on Rua Monte Alegre 635 a, quote, galactic Brazilian observatory rooted in São Paulo, the center of operations from which he mailed books and letters to the outside world as leader of a movement of literary innovation, concrete poetry. His early contact with Pound in the 1950s marked the beginning of interchanges with creative personalities around the world. He was invited to Yale as visiting professor in spring 1978 by Emir Rodrigues Munigal. Haroldo's energy, enthusiasm, and creative ideas have only spread after his death in 2003, attracting the interest of a new generation of scholars drawn to his most engaging ideas and theories. These include his early internationalism, his concept of synchronic invention across time and space in world literature, the role of cannibalism in Brazilian literature and arts, his translations of Goethe, Dante, and Homer alongside classical Chinese poetry and the No theater, his prose epic Galaxias, and the imagined final voyage of Ulysses to Brazil in the poem Finis Mundo, A Última Viagem. Haroldo stated in an interview that his relationship to tradition was musical, although we can also see him as an imagist, a painter, sculptor, a wordsmith, a scholar and linguist working in a space where theory and the arts came together. Haroldo was always as open in his ideas as in his works. Rua Monte Alegre, 635, became the center of a polytopical and polyphonic planetary civilization, to quote a line from his celebrated essay on cannibal reason. Today's panelists were all at Yale for the December 2019 conference, Haroldo de Campos, Poetry, Criticism, Translation. We had so much fun. Everyone felt the unusual solidarity around Haroldo's work and the pleasure of being together. And now we're revisiting the event in virtual company for the first time. Even though it may seem as if time has stood still during our academic confinement and banishment to Zoom, thanks to the coordination of Eduardo Jorge, translations by Gustavo Reis, and the collaboration of all the authors, today we can announce the impending publication by Peter Lang of a book of essays on Haroldo coming from the Zurich and Yale conferences, titled Haroldopedia, Poesia, Critica, Tradução, Haroldo de Campos, Haroldopedia, Poetry, Criticism, Translation. Our participating authors today reflect the international reception of Haroldo de Campos. They will be speaking from Los Angeles, Berkeley, Edmonton, Alberta, Philadelphia, New Haven, Berlin, and Zurich, 9 time zones. Their diverse work on Haroldo takes us back to the congeniality of the Zurich-Yale conferences as we revisit the appeal of Haroldo's poetry, criticism, and transcreation to a new generation of young scholars. Now my co-host, Eduardo Jorge, will continue the introduction and present today's speakers. Thank you very much, Eduardo.
Thank you, David. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here and to continue this conversation that gets started in 2019 before the pandemic. And so I'm going to talk about the idea for the title of the book, Haroldopedia, because this came from a poem that Haroldo de Campos published in 1951, which the title is Haroldopedia ou a Educação do Príncipe, or Haroldopedia, or the Education of Prince. The poem is divided in 11 parts, oscillating between prose, poetry, and theater. Let's remember that Haroldo de Campos' first book, Auto do Possesso, something like Auto of Possessed, 1948, 1951, is an auto that is an Iberian theatrical form par excellence. But what deserves to be emphasized here is how this poem, there is an idea of a sensibility education that is so important in Haroldo de Campos' work. The prince in question is a student of instinct, aluno do instinto, and he learns it with accuracy, rigor. And there is a pedagogical force of the instinct and senses in all activities we are highlighting here today: critics, poetry, translation. And let me talk a little bit about the structure of the current book. It is 21 essays that mix more experienced authors on Haroldo de Campos' poetics with young researchers. In this mixture, we have contributions from Brazil, Portugal, Italy, the United States, Germany, Poland, Austria, France, and Switzerland. In the 21 essays are divided in 4 parts. The first part of the book, Signances. The second one, Uninterrupted Flight, Aesthetics and Politics, Voo Ininterrupto, Estética e Política. That's a way to show how politics has a place in Haroldo de Campos' thoughts and work. And third, the cosmonaut of the signifier. So this wonderful expression from João Alexandre Barbosa. And 4, transcreations on the Baroque and anthropophagic translation. So we also found an interview Haroldo de Campos gave in Paris in the mid-80s, and that was never published. And Jacques Dongui, who interviewed him at the time, transcribed it recently and especially for the book, and kindly lent it to us for the publication. So we have a new interview, as well as a timeline prepared especially for the book by Júlio Mendonça, mentioned already by Kenneth David Jackson. And just to finish, before to give the floor to the authors, with this, we hope the book will find a good resonance outside Brazil, spreading the importance of Haroldo de Campos' poetry, translation, transcreations, practices, and criticism. And due to the fact we have the authors here to talk a little bit about their essays, I would like to invite, and then we have the first one is Adam. So Adam, please, the floor is yours. And I'm really happy to meet you virtually again.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. Thank you so much, David. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. I'm going to be very brief, speak about 5 minutes or so about my article. It's called Potência Intensiva, Multiarticulação, Afeto, Ideograma e Política em Haroldo de Campos. So I don't know, can I share my screen really quickly? This will maybe help with just some of the ideas. Let me get here. Okay. Let me share. Very good. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, so there's the title of the essay. Here's a picture of Haroldo. Here's some of the, I just extracted yesterday, putting this together, 12 ideas that are kind of circulating in the essay theses, let's say, from this Potência Intensiva, what's going on in the essay. Again, I'm really honored and thankful, and it's great to see everyone be here again. Although virtually, I hope we can come together again soon. So the essay basically, and I'm going to read some of this in Portuguese as well, but just to give an overview in English, it articulates a new vision of the poesia participante, the political participatory poetry of Haroldo de Campos. It engages a landmark poem by him that's kind of underread, Servidão de Passagem, which was published in 1962. The article engages heavily with the work of Jean-Paul Sartre. The relationship of Poesia Concreta and Jean-Paul Sartre has been understudied. So I look at how Sartre is kind of written with and against in this essay, as well as looking at the relationship of the ideogramma, the conception of the paidelma, anthropophagia, Oswaldo de Andrade, right? And then I'm looking at Jacobson as well. So there's an elenco, a paidelma at work here. And I make the argument basically that Sartre should be also a part of the paidelma. Usually you think of Mallarmé, you think of Oswaldo, you think of the big pound, right? With respect to the elenco de essa tradição viva, the live tradition of the paidelma, right? But I also engaged Sartre because I think he's super important with respect to the problem of what is literature, what is the political function of literature for the concretos, right? And so Servidão de Passagem, I argue, is a landmark work that that is worthy of reconsideration. So just briefly, the theses are a questão do engajamento e da forma, não é? A questão crucial do engajamento implicava naturalmente revolucionar a forma, right? So revolutionizing form. The second thesis is this whole thing about situating poetry, because this was a big problem in Sartre as well. And the concretes used this when they talked about the paidelma. We need to situate our poetry historically, situate it in world literature, situate it with respect to the situation nationally, politically in the 1960s. So a poesia concreta cultivou protótipos, and we can see examples of these protótipos, political poems nos anos 60. And here's a fragment of Servidão de Passagem. Cultivou protótipos que sempre acabaram por situar sua produção contra o idealismo literário, não é? Situar a poesia significava mapear e redescobrir sua densidade semiótica no horizonte cultural morfológico, the paidelma, right? So situating their work within the cultural morphology, within the paidelma, but also politically, historically. Returning to this. So then we go into a concepção do ideograma de Pound e Fenollosa, right? A concepção do ideograma de Pound e Fenollosa era não apenas método para a geração e apreensão dinâmica das palavras em toda a sua densidade, mas também a linguagem adequada para a mente contemporânea. So an ideogrammatic mindset, right? They saw it as a forma mentis. To think ideogrammatically was also to think historically and politically as well. So I try to make that connection, drawing on not just in terms of the poem itself, in terms of its form and its dynamism. Na medida em que permitia a comunicação, this citing Haroldo, no seu grau mais rápido. All right, so fourth, Sartre, no, and the ideogram. Contra a descrição, Sartre havia aconselhado os escritores franceses a mergulhar as coisas na ação, so to place things in action through prose for Sartre, right? E recorrer aos mass media, não é? Como os concretos também, para conquistar o público virtual. O ideograma, concebido como uma forma mentis, permitiu aos poetas reelaborar a teoria de Sartre in the book, What is Literature, right? So here we have a picture of Sartre, and just a little homage to Sartre in Brazil in 1960 when he visited with Simone de Beauvoir. And then let's go to this thesis. Situar a poesia concreta e a antropofagia. Situar a poesia concreta brasileira também envolvia forjar o que Oswaldo de Andrade chamou de roteiros, caminhos e trajetórias para uma nova concepção sintético-ideogrâmica da poesia em coordenadas nacionais e internacionais. Nos anos 50, isso implicava adotar a concepção de Pound de paidelma constelatório, entendido como uma elevação de uma tradição viva, um elenco de autores culturalmente atuantes no momento histórico. Again, Sartre should be part of this paidelma. That's the argument. Okay, and then the 60s, o reposicionamento da poesia concreta in the 60s, right? O reposicionamento da produção poética de Noigandris voltou-se para a intensificação da relação com aquilo que Campos chamou da fisionomia e as demandas do tempo. And then I'm quoting from an article that was published in Spanish, right? Because that's the only access I have to this interview, this essay. Se piensa una poesía inscrita en el mundo de la producción, con un nuevo lenguaje poético realmente contemporáneo. No? So a productionist model, this idea that concrete poetry, and you can see this in the Revista Invenção as well, right? We're poetas produtores, poetas inventores, no? So situating it with that political discourse as well. 7, uma nova sintaxe e o salto participante. So we've seen some of those prototypes, like Olho por Olho by Eduardo de Campos. But all right, so uma nova sintaxe e o salto participante. Por conseguinte, para responder às pressões da história, para criar uma sintaxe em consonância com os dilemas e dissensões do subdesenvolvimento nos anos 60, do vanguardismo e da revolução, Noigandris arquitetou poemas multiformes a fim de encenar uso incisivo da linguagem. Tal poesia, que Campos chamaria de poesia de base e poesia, refletiria o processo poético, seria como uma metapoesia, mesmo quando mostrava sua linguagem como meio fenomenológico sem fim, como agenciamento paronomástico, verbívoco visual e gerativo ou interação estrutural de funções, de modo a revelar as contradições do processo dialético, poesia-tempo, história, e dar razão ao trânsito em direção à ação. A grande conquista do salto participante para Campos era a superação da maldição sartriana ao colocar a poesia em crise. Porque, you remember, for Sartre, poetry was banned from commitment, right? So he wanted to superar esse dilema, and he said, todo poema novo, this is a letter he wrote to Afonso Ávila sobre esse debate, sobre what the concretes needed to do to be political and avant-garde as well. And he said, in this beautiful letter that he wrote to Afonso Ávila, todo poema novo põe a poesia em crise, right? Every new poem places poetry in crisis. Não há pacificação dessa dialética. E por isso que a arte da poesia não é nunca uma arte do meio termo. Right? You can see that the whole political debate was really hot and important for Campos in the 60s. And then multi-articulação. So that's another important dimension. So, and so the concretism, politically speaking, has been given a bad rap, right? By the Brazilians and by critics internationally, it's been kind of under-recognized, right? And so, indo de encontro às inúmeras críticas feitas ao esteticismo abstruso, the abstract, abstruse aestheticism of the concrete poets, e a instrumentalização da poesia concreta, a tarefa crítica que Campos confia à servidão não se relacionava nem com representar o brasileiro destituído a partir de uma perspectiva paternalista, nem aferrar-se ao poema cegamente ao movimento criativo paralelo à revolução social. Em lugar disso, o que está em questão eram os modos incisivos pelos quais o poema mediava entre poesia, política e história. So the poem becomes like this nexus that mediates between history, politics, and the poem proper, right? And that's kind of its political function by placing all of those in relation in a conscientization, as he would call it, right? So then there's been another critique of the poem, widespread, just continuing what I consider to be a false problem, theoretically speaking, lamentar a ineficácia histórica de poema é falso problema, right? I mean, to say that a poem changes the course of history or that it, overthrows a government is really a false problem. That's really not how to look at commitment, right? It's to look at the language itself, as the concretes insisted, and it's, mobilizing discourses to, engage us with these problems effectively, politically, sensorially, and so forth, right? As a problem to be thought through the language, right? Not that it's going to overthrow a government by itself or something like that. So that's un falso problema. Then point 10, really quickly here, o lugar de servidão. So where is the place of servidão in the canon, right, of Haroldo, right? Servidão é texto divisor de águas, cuja revelação nos dias de hoje inscreve uma chave de leitura para entender o legado de Campos e os debates em torno do experimentalismo literário, engajamento e revolução na América Latina. It's a very important text, and I just wanted to hit upon that. It's something that really should be read carefully. It's a wonderful poem. So, point 11, antiliteratura. Campos enxergou na sua poesia participante uma oportunidade de conceber outro tipo de discurso poético, uma antiliteratura, cujas experimentações não seriam produzidas por militante despótico, jadenovista, nem pela maquiação da aversão da Sartre à poesia, right? So a new image of literature right here. And then finally, and this is what Décio Pignatari will call the concretes, a political term, como uma antropologia poética, right? So Campos forjou uma concepção mediadora, this is concluding here, mediadora da escritura, enquanto sintético-ideogramática em coordenadas nacionais. Ele buscava criar isomorfismos e relações, através do poema, isomorfismos e relações de intercâmbio e ressonância mútuos entre forças criativas, inclusive movimentos políticos, formas de vanguarda e história. De fato, ao mediar forças extratextuais não poéticas em suas próprias dobras e ao chamar atenção para o ato poético como processo adâmico de nomeação e de autoquestionamento, o texto de Campos desenrola-se, segundo Pignatari, como uma antropologia poética. So, these are the 12 theses of the article. Of course, there's a close reading of the poem there. I spare you that here, but I just wanted to articulate some of the ideas that were at stake. Thank you so much for your time.
Here we go.
Thank you, Adam. So great presentation. So we are looking forward to read your article printed in a book. So the next presentation is Nathaniel. So I'm really glad to see you again, Nathaniel.
Obrigado. Okay, I'm going to open up my little presentation here as well. Everyone can see it okay? Okay. Okay, thank you so much to Eduardo and David for the opportunity to be part of this book and for the conference. It's been such a wonderful opportunity and really enjoyable. And thank you to everyone who's here today. I'm so happy to be reconvening, if online. So, so today we might read this poem by Décio Pignatari, Terra, as evoking the imminent destruction of the earth at breakneck speed. The poem's single word, terra, falls apart into pieces, becoming fragmented as it is divvied up. The T that resembles a cross gestures, one could argue, to the history of plunder linked to colonization. The repeated sounds of T's and double R's, mimic an axe and chainsaw. Words convey ownership, terra, have earth, and illness, hara terra. The poem stutters as it disarticulates its only word. Yet in his essay, Poesia Concreta, Linguagem e Comunicação from 1957, Haroldo would focus on Teja, this poem, but he opted to understate its semantic dimension, its message, one might say. Haroldo's selective analysis of the poem demands asking how concrete poetry of this particular period, this what is sometimes called the Orthodox period, relates semantically to the real world. And so there's a kind of ambivalence within this essay about how to treat the message of the poem. At one point he says that one could, he says, quote, the simple act of tossing on paper the word teja could denote an entire Georgic, a pastoral poem, really an anti-pastoral poem, a Georgic. But then later in the same essay, he says, since teja is not a Georgic, and it narrates nothing that could appease an imagination prone to discourses on nature or pastoral eclogues, its content, such as a concrete painting, is also its structure. So there's a kind of ambivalence with how to treat the content of this poem. Of course, as Adam was discussing in his later poems, like Servidão da Passagem, only from a few years later, and his Longe Esquerda da História from decades later, 96, Haroldo would confront destruction and crises more directly. But in this particular essay, he's sort of consciously diminishing the semantic of this poem in some sense. And so in my collaboration in the book, I explore how Haroldo's essay described Decio's poem Teja as an example of a cybernetic poem. And in doing so, broadcasted to readers of the Sunday supplement of the Jornal do Brasil what he and his group were reading at the time. He laid out his interest in two theoretical movements. One, the general semantics movement. Infrequently discussed today, the general semantics philosophy of the Polish-American Alfred Korzybski described the limitations of human knowledge as a direct function of the structure of language, and earned fame and followers by allowing for broad applications of its major discussions on meaning to wide-ranging themes within culture and politics. The general semanticists took from the Aristotelian tradition an interrogative view of the mechanics of interpretation, but saw themselves as decidedly breaking with Aristotle's attachment to the syntactical and semantic norms of discourse. By drawing on this school, Haroldo made it clear that Pignatari's poem is not discursive in any traditional or conventional sense and communicates otherwise. This argument, in turn, relates to the second philosophical trend he described in his essay, cybernetics and its new relevance for concrete poetry. So in this essay, Haroldo borrowed from W. Slutkin's Minds and Machines, a book from 1954, to describe Teja as a cybernetic machine, a poem that is like a cybernetic machine. In a key moment, Haroldo notes that Decio's poem self-corrects itself in order to maintain its design, correcting an error in its design through a kind of feedback mechanism, the inclusion of an additional syllable, an RA or ha, in the seventh line. In terms of information theory, the measure combats the introduction of noise to maintain the poem's visual pattern. And he calls this addition of this extra syllable ha a process of retroalimentação or feedback, memorized by the poem and altering its subsequent actions. By drawing on these two theoretical traditions, Haroldo makes the polemical point that Pignatari's poem is not about nature. Instead, it pseudo-mathematically enacts a new technological poetry. Such a poem necessitates a different kind of analysis since its words are not about anything. I believe that this argument is very interesting in itself because it brings up a whole slew of questions related to hermeneutics and poetics, materiality and meaning, topics that Craig Dworkin and Marjorie Perloff have written about, and we were lucky to have them participate in our seminar. And so in my essay, I explore this desire, Haroldo's desire at this particular time to read the poem against meaning. And I think that desire will change over time in his career. But at this particular moment in the mid-50s, he's thinking about that. But today, in this presentation, I want to also suggest, by way of a conclusion, and this is not included in the essay, but that beyond rehearsing semantic questions related to literary criticism and language philosophy, Haroldo's analysis of Teja also demonstrates his burgeoning interest in media theory. I refer here to his formal comparison of Pignatari's poem to two technologies of communication. He claims in this same essay that the word terra proceeds visually in the poem in measured sequence, as if the letters are advancing one by one in an LED sign, or, he says, in a teletype band. The first comparison is rather clear. The poem's visual flow recalls the commercial LED band we are familiar with still today. The second comparison to the teletype band is less immediately recognizable. A teletype machine was an electromechanical communication device employed throughout the early and mid-20th century to send and receive messages, replacing the telegraph, the use of Morse code, and the postal service in issuing telegrams. In Brazil, the teletype, or telecipo, contributed to the evolution of the nation's press media at the beginning of the 20th century by expanding its capacity for distribution of international news. As you can see in this image here, operators would type a message, which would then be transformed into code by the machine's mechanical system, which was then punched onto a coiled strip, which you can see on the left of the image. That was funneled back into the machine, processed, and sent to another teletype unit, which would in turn type up and print the coded information. This strip, used for information processing and storage, predated the hollerith cards of early computers by similarly abstracting messages into bits of information. On the one hand, by relating the poem to the teletype technology, Haroldo highlights how terra breaks down its single word into pieces. So if we think about this strip that breaks the sort of just the words into these dots or codes, it recalls in a way how terra is broken down into pieces. And we can think also how other concrete poems a little bit later, actually no, around the same time as well, was similarly interested in translating words into code, to computerized code. So we have here in 1975, Cidade translated into code Augusto de Campos' poem in collaboration with Etus Albina de Souza. And earlier, we have Vladimir Giaspino's Solida, which is also an experiment on translating words into code. But what's also interesting to me, and I'm concluding now, is that indeed it was the mining industry in Brazil that invested most heavily in this technology. I'm talking now about the teletype. Indeed, in the 1950s, the company Companhia Vale do Rio Doce developed its Victoria Minas railway lines and installed teletypes at railway hubs to control rail traffic. And so they were the big promoters of this technology in Brazil in the 50s. Was Haroldo considering this development of the railroad, which clearly involved the destruction of indigenous land and forests, when he compared the visual display of terra to a teletype machine? By evoking this teletext technology, Haroldo, in a way, circles back to the anti-pastoral or Georgic semantics of the poem, this idea of the destruction of nature, the same theme he states and then denies stating in a kind of paralepsis or conscious omission. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathaniel, for this wonderful presentation. So, Critic, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Eduardo. And before I started, I just wanted to thank you, Eduardo, and David for organizing the conference and organizing this book, which I'm so happy to be a part of. And I wanted to thank Kleis as well for their efforts in organizing the conference and for organizing this event too. So it's wonderful to see everyone that I met in what was, for most of us, the last conference before the pandemic. So it's wonderful to see so many of you from the conference. Yeah, so my essay focuses on the so-called early poetry of Haroldo de Campos, which is usually taken to mean the work he published from 1949 to 1956, with the latter year marking the launch of Brazilian concrete poetry. I chose this particular period of Haroldo's long career in part because it tends to receive less critical attention than concrete poetry, and his long poem in prose Galaxias, or his literary criticism and extensive translation work. So I was interested in how this initial phase of Haroldo's career was regarded not only by scholars of his work, but also by the poet himself. So in an interview given in 1978, in which he looks back on this early poetry, Haroldo stated that the prose poetry of Galaxias recovered certain elements of the, quote, Baroque prehistory of his concrete poetry. So one of the questions that interested me was how to make sense of this ambivalent gesture towards the early poetry, in which the poet recognizes its presence in his later work, but through which he also distances himself from it, defining it as prehistory and only in relation to concrete poetry. So I try to situate my reading of the early poetry within a general rhetorical strategy that Haroldo developed throughout his career, not only in his poetry, but also in his essays of literary criticism and his translations, that centers on the question or the theme of the beginning. And this theme is dramatized in one form or another in nearly all of the early poems, which deal not only with the birth of the poet as poet, but also with the place of poetry within the context of other quote unquote beginnings, the beginnings of culture, myth, history, and political life, which take place against the background of a diverse array of settings adapted from the ancient world. So through a close reading of a few of the early poems, I try to show how their form, images, and allusions develop a particular conception of the beginning as ontologically dubious, as multiple, and above all, as imbued with the force of paradox. So I try to show how this conception of the beginning is developed further in Haroldo's later poetry, in his essays on the Baroque as a particular kind of beginning for Brazilian literature, and even in his work as a translator of poetry. And I try to make sense of this rhetorical construction of the beginning by putting Haroldo's work in dialogue with the Cuban poet José Lezama Lima, another figure for whom the dual questions of the origins or the beginnings of artistic culture in Latin America and the Baroque period were vital. So in an essay on the relation of poetry to myth and history, Lezama Lima turns to the philosophy of Giambattista Vico, Italian philosopher from the first half of the 18th century, to argue that the origins of poetry and language lie in the imaginative elaboration of myths. Quoting Vico, Lezama Lima claims that the specific material of poetry is that which is, quote, impossible yet believed. And here he's referring specifically to the explanation of natural phenomena through the creation of myths. And both Vico's arguments and Lezama Lima's is that the quote unquote beginning of poetry is a highly imaginative act that is at the heart of other beginnings, like those of myth and history, and of religious and political life. So this theory of beginnings, which rests on the force of paradox, the tension between impossibility on one hand and credibility on the other, is the interpretive frame that I use to develop my reading of the early poetry and the relation of the early poetry to Haroldo's later work. And I conclude the essay by showing how Haroldo returns in one of his very last texts to a couple very specific images from two early poems. And this late poem is titled 2000 and was published in the Folha de São Paulo on January 1st, 2000, right, to mark the turn of the millennium, and in a way dramatizes once again the theme of the beginning. And so that's my way of kind of reiterating this line of continuity in terms of the theme of the beginning from the early poetry all the way to the very end of Haroldo's career. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Craig. A wonderful lecture. Now we are going to Odile. Odile, are you here? The floor is yours. Thank you. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada também, Eduardo. Bom te ver novamente. Thank you so much also to David Jackson. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, guys. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much to David and to Eduardo and to Yale for organizing this wonderful opportunity for us to share again our enthusiasm on Haroldo. It's wonderful to see everybody here and well, to see that, you know, the spirit of Haroldo, I think, is still with us. So I will speak a little bit about my essay, and then I will talk a little bit about a new project that I have at the moment. So the essay in the book stems basically from my interest in translating Haroldo. And I have just, I've completed the full translation of Galaxias into English, the first full translation, which is coming out from Ugly Duckling Press next year. And so my essay deals with, it's a reflection on the question of on things that I noticed in the process of translating Haroldo. So I have a very short excerpt from that essay that I will talk about, that I will read and then talk a little bit about the various parts of that essay. So if translation is the closest form of reading that one can make of a text, the privilege of translating Galaxias, Haroldo de Campos' most fascinating works, I would say, provides a translation with a unique insight into the complexities and riches. So it's multiple meanings and reverberations. This attentive reading then provided me with many surprises, and that's what the essay is based on. And by my reflection is guided by three key concepts or motifs that, in my view, run through the text of Galaxias. And I was happy to hear Craig's talk, because, of course, one of them has to do with origins, right? It's a theme that just is throughout the whole work of Haroldo. So the three nouns in my title, by the way, I guess I didn't mention the title of the essay. In Portuguese is Uma viagem à origem da linguagem, início, percurso e poliglossia. In English, it would be something like a journey to the origin of language, beginnings, route, and polyglossia. So the first concept is the concept of journey or travel, second, origin, and the third, language. So besides reflecting on how Galaxias is a meditation on origins and travels, I also comment on Haroldo's project to recover or reactivate the poetic word, so to speak. So to creating, I guess, for Portuguese, a kind of repository or archive of lost or hidden meanings and resonances. So he does for Portuguese what, according to some critics, James Joyce's work did for English. So in the essay, then I sort of highlight the role of polyglossia or multilingualism. And there's an entire field of multilingual poetry, which is very fascinating. And Galaxias, I think, is right at the center of that. And so I propose then a reading that meditates on the motif of the beginning, that attends to the figure of the journey, and that explores from various angles the multilingualism of the text. There's several sections in the essay. So first I talk about origins and non-origins. So I'm completely in agreement with Craig, this sort of paradoxical idea of the origin being, sort of stated and then negated, continually. Then the second part talks about a viagem como livro e o livro como viagem, livros viajantes e viagens livrescas. So something about the book as travel and travel as book, or bookish travel, so being kind of an armchair traveler, and at the same time being, the book itself being a form of travel. The third part talks about the aesthetics of the objet trouvé or collage, which is also at the heart of this, specifically the collage of language and the found bits of language that are incorporated into Galaxias. The third part, the next part, talks about the foreign words that are used as mantras. So the value, Haroldo makes this very clear in a note to Galaxias, that one of the purposes of having these words that not everybody can understand. So he quotes some Czech words, and I happen to know a little bit of Czech, so, but most people it's a sort of an obscure language, I guess. And so these words function as a kind of mantra. So they have a sort of mantric or transmantric, value. I also talk about the romantic spirit of language. As a romantics thought that language was this entire, sort of this big unity, and we only, see fragments. Every language is a fragment of this big sort of a panorama of language, a sort of this mosaic. And I think that's very present in Galaxias as well. And then finally, I talk about how Galaxias is also a kind of homage to a number of figures, both, actual, figures that he met, so there's a lot of actual sort of anecdotal and maybe even documentary value in Galaxias, but there's also the literary homage, very much in the spirit of Pound. And so I end a little bit, sort of alluding to Mallarmé's impossible book, this imagined book, which he never realized. So the idea, Le Livre, this imagined book made of fragments of quotations from other books, which was an attempt to encompass all of literature. And I think Galaxias points to a similar goal, but on another level because of its emphasis on multilingualism. And it allows us to kind of glimpse the pre-Babel unity of our languages and this sort of polyglot play with the limits of intelligibility. Haroldo sort of embarks on a journey to the origins, aiming to write language with a capital L. And what I just want to mention very briefly is I'm starting a new project, which is called Innovative Poetics, Haroldo de Campos Innovative Poetics for a Plural World. And this is a large project, it's very ambitious. It's the idea of trying to understand, if it can be understood, sort of the totality of Haroldo's work, as forming a kind of unity that in some ways can counter our contemporary erosion of culture and this sort of loss that we've, the dangers of cultural homogenization by economic globalization. And I think Haroldo really is that kind of figure for me. He not only made many revolutionary critical contributions during his long, decades-long career, but he's also very relevant, I think, for contemporary audiences at the moment. The plurality of literary paths around the globe that he brought to the fore. He proposes a new model of world literature, I believe, which is fascinating because it's coming not from the center, right, but from the margins. So I really hope that this project, which will be both a monograph and a website, so have that kind of power to disseminate his work as well. I hope that this will bring Haroldo to even wider audiences. So I think this is particularly timely at a moment when we are faced with social, political, and cultural division, and turning to a figure such as de Campos, who can bring worldviews, and in a shared vision to counter cultural loss and shift the cultural balance from center to periphery, can really help us confront this division in this very polarized world that we live in. It also envisions harnessing the power of digital platforms for knowledge mobilization. So thank you so much.
So, wow, wonderful project. So, thank you very much, Odília. Muito obrigado. And now, Gustavo, are you? Yeah. Olá, yeah. The floor is yours. Bem-vindo.
Thank you, Eduardo, and thank you, David, and the CLISE team as well, especially Asia and Megan, who are with us here today. So my contribution to the book is called, is an essay with a very short title called The Transepocal Concrete. That is the concreto transepocal in Portuguese, which is a suggestion that I took from one of Haroldo's most well-known essays that he published in 1984, whose title I'm translating to English now, called Poetry and Modernity, From the Death of Art to the Constellation, the Post-Utopian Poem, in which he famously developed his concept of post-utopia to reflect on contemporary poetry, which he took from Walter Benjamin's Jetztzeit. And this post-utopian poetry is distinguished by what Haroldo calls a pluralization of possible poetics, that is his expression, and observes one crucial difference in relation to the previous avant-garde moment, which is a relationship with a literary legacy that is one of a production and not of a combative one, right? Because avant-garde tend to be very hostile to the literary legacy, to the so-called canon, which is a different relationship the concrete poetry and Haroldo specifically had. He was a poet. He considered himself an avant-garde poet. He had a very solid avant-garde background, but still he translated Homer, he translated Jorge, he translated and read Homer, Goethe, Dante, and many others. And in this essay, Haroldo shifts from concretism towards a more open-ended notion of concrete poetry, which he describes as a global open process of sign concretion, ever updated in different forms along the various epochs of history and in various material instances of language. And in this sense, many poets can be considered concretes, albeit if they're not concretists, such as Sappho, Dante, Hölderlin, Mallarmé, and many others. So upon those reflections, I have coined this term, transepochal concrete. That is not a matter of trying to fit all the literary tradition into a concretist rule, but instead proposing the creation of a new Jetztzeit to report a discussion back to Benjamin. And in that sense, the concept of arrière-garde, Marjorie Perloff, who also participated in the original symposium, she develops the concept of arrière-garde in her book, Unoriginal Genius, greatly contributed to this conception of what I call transepochal concrete. Arrière-garde is not the opposite of avant-garde, but rather a stance before the avant-garde, which identifies it, that is, avant-garde as also part of the literary heritage, the same way as Homer or Shakespeare or Cervantes are. In that book, Unoriginal Genius, Perloff refers to the concrete poets in the 50s in Brazil who integrated Mallarmé, Joyce, and Pound. And that modus operandi resembles very much the one that Benjamin does in his Arcades project, which was a book, a project who consumed much of his life, in which he considered his main project, right? And my approximation here between Haroldo and concrete poetry and Benjamin is not a fortuitous one, since Benjamin's philosophy was very present and very important in the formation of Haroldo's, not only of his translation conceptions, but also his conception of history and of literary history of that, for that matter. In this very same essay on post-utopia, Haroldo evokes a lesser-known text by Benjamin, which is in Einbahnstraße, One-Way Street, called Attested Auditor of Books, in which Benjamin looks at Mallarmé's poems, A Throw of the Dice, which, as we know here, was very important for the concretists. And in that essay, Benjamin claims that the poem, Mallarmé's A Throw of the Dice, was the first to incorporate the graphic tensions of advertisement. And by doing so, it expelled writing from the sanctuary of the book and into the, I quote him, the brutal heteronomies of economic chaos, which is a very interesting formulation. So I defend that the Arcades project is sort of Benjamin trying to do the same thing as Mallarmé did in The Throw of the Dice. So in the expose of the book, Benjamin signals that to understand the essence of history, it suffices to compare Herodotus and the morning newspaper. That is one of the earliest accounts of history with the most recent and ephemeral one, which is the newspaper. So the Arcades are then divided in several sections, each comprising short blocks of texts, reflecting on many issues such as history, advertising, fashion, and whatnots. So the spatial revolution in the blank space of the page that the press, the newspaper realized is present to some extent both in Mallarmé's poem, The Throw of the Dice, and in Benjamin's Arcades project, as well as in concrete poetry, as we all know. The Arcades project I defend follows the same principle of A Throw of the Dice. And the weighty stillness of the current editions, which is like a very large and thick book, masks the hypertextual nature of the Arcades. And it would not be inaccurate to say that Benjamin did in the Arcades what Mallarmé had done first in The Throw of the Dice. So in that sense, I defend that Benjamin is also part, as Mallarmé, of that concrete family of poets and thinkers. And sort of like in the same way Adam defends that Sartre should be incorporated to the Paidoma, I do something similar here, or try to do something similar here with Benjamin. And the latter part of my essay is dedicated to the figure of Kenneth Goldsmith, which is a poet who Marjorie Perloff also studies in an original genius, and who also had a relationship with Brazilian concrete poetry. And in her book, Perloff reports that during a roundtable attended by another Brazilian concrete poet, Décio Pinhatari, in 2001, Goldsmith observed that everything Pinhatari had written about in the 60s on enunciation, content, interface, and mass media seemed to be a foretelling of the internet experience. So it is as if concrete poetry had finally found its ideal medium for the ideas that were developed decades earlier. And a most recent example of that can be viewed in Haroldo de Campos' Instagram page, in which he publishes many poems that are, he posts some of his better known poems, but also poems that are specifically thought and made for that medium, right? And in 2015, Goldsmith publishes his New York, Capital of the 20th Century, whose title is an echo of Benjamin and his famous study of Paris, capital of the 19th century, which is also part of the larger project of the Arcades, which seeks to retrace Benjamin's steps in the Arcades, but in a new context, a new capital, and a new century, New York in the 20th century, that is. And derives from literature, but from other media as well, like film and even email. So it would be like a new version of what Adil was referring to as the Mallarméan project of the book, like Le Livre, which would like comprise everything. So, and the book's premise is ironic from the get-go, from the claim to impose an original work comprised entirely of quotations to the election of the book format, especially one of such dimensions. So the bottom line of my reflection here is the issue of the support, the support for poetry, right? Which is part of the concrete revolution. And the concept of Ariagat meets here an ultimatum, I would say. Transepocal concrete shows at the same time its permanence and versatility. It may take many different forms, but they are all connected to the process of sign concretion that Haroldo referred to. Not only concretion of the signifier, that is the word, but also the medium itself. Concrete poetry has proven to be an ongoing revolution, not only of aesthetics, but of epistemology. It has not abolished the book, but it has given it a new form and a new meaning. Thanks everyone for your attention, and happy to see everyone.
Thanks. Thank you, Gustavo. Wonderful. So I would like to invite Giacomo. Giacomo.
Hi, everyone.
Nice to see you.
Hi. Hi, good to see you. Well, first of all, I join you all in saying that, well, I'm really happy to see you again. I'm one of those, like Craig mentioned before, like for whom like our conference here at Yale was one of the last big events before the pandemic. So I'm glad to see we are moving forward in many, many senses. And yeah, so well, my article, my contribution for the book is entitled Ulysses Between Chaos and Creation. And in it, I present a new Italian translation of Haroldo's poem Finismondo a ultima viagem. The figure of Ulysses appears in many of Haroldo's works. In his collection of poems and translations entitled Entre Millennios, for instance, we can see how Haroldo confronts himself with the Greek hero, playing on his multifaceted nature on a linguistic level. Ulysses is polutropos in the Greek original, that is to say, in Haroldo's words, multimanioso, multiglorioso, multimaligno, multilabioso, and so on. In the first part of my article, I present Finismondo a ultima viagem as Haroldo's most complex engagement with the figure of Ulysses and its long-lasting tradition, arguing for the poem to be considered at the level of other works such as Tennyson's, Joyce's, and Kazantzakis. At the same time, the poem's most direct point of reference is, of course, Dante. Inferno 26, the canto of Ulysses, is where Dante imagines his ultima viagem, his last voyage, tragically ended in shipwreck. And my article hinges on the significance of a passage of Finismondo and the choice I made in my Italian translation. And I'm reading from Haroldo's poem. O mar atrás do mar, o envio obscuro caos pelaginoso, até onde se esconde a proibida geografia do Éden, paradiso terreno. This is the ocean on which Ulysses is voyaging, once trespassed the pillars of Hercules, the prescribed limits of the world. I am interested in the nature of the sea behind the sea, the mar atrás do mar. I argue that Haroldo is here introducing an element alien to Dante's text, namely the classical and biblical tradition of the ocean as chaos. The ocean, that is to say, as a liminal element, still showing some instances of the confused state of matter before the creation of the world, the caos pelaginoso. Dante does not explicitly reference that tradition, but Haroldo's poem allows us to go back to his text and perceive this hidden pattern. From here, in the second part of my article, I discuss a specific instance of my translation directly related to this highly intertextual passage on the ocean of chaos. Writes Haroldo, o não mapeado finismundo, ali onde começa a infraqueada fronteira do extraseu. And I translate in Italian. Fuori da ogni mappa finismondo, laggiù dove comincia l'infranta frontiera del celeste extraconfine. I turned extraseu into celeste extraconfine. The words celeste confine, literally celestial border, are found in the first draft of the Infinito, the Infinite, the most famous poem of the Romantic Italian poet Giacomo Leopardi. As I argue in another article, the possible source of Leopardi's original choice is the Italian 18th century translation by Paolo Rolli of John Milton's Paradise Lost. In Book 7 of the English poem, there is a passage in which the celestial army, guided by the sun, is about to enter the ocean of chaos to create the universe. And I quote from Milton, Paradise Lost, Book 7. On heavenly ground they stood, and from the shore they view the vast immeasurable abyss, outrageous as a sea, dark, wasteful, wild, up from the bottom turned by furious winds and surging waves as mountains to assault heaven's height, and with the center mix the fold. End of the quote. Milton's heavenly ground became celeste confine in Raleigh's version, and Leopardi used it in his first draft of L'Infinito, and despite discarding it immediately, choosing rather the Petrarchan line Ultimo Orizzonte, these words, celeste confine, became famous after him and used in the Italian literary tradition. Hence, I decided to continue this tradition by using these words in my version, in my Italian version of Haroldo's Finismondo, as a way to link them again to a context related to the ocean of chaos and to pay homage to Haroldo's intertextual practice using lines from a poet, Giacomo Leopardi, deeply loved by Haroldo himself. In the final part of my article, I address the shipwreck in the text, that is to say, the way Haroldo makes the shipwreck visible in a very concrete way in the disrupted word disposition, alluding to, of course, to Malasme Ancoupédé. So with my article and with my Italian translation of Finismondo, I aim at continuing, so to speak, Ulysses' last voyage, Ultima Viagem and Ultimo Viaggio, in the wider context of not only Brazilian literature and not only Italian literature, but world literature. And let me say that I'm very grateful for this opportunity, because I have to say that this reflection on the ocean as chaos, which was, as I said, the center of my paper read at the conference, has become actually the center of my PhD dissertation project as well, which is not centered on Haroldo. Maybe I'm gonna include Haroldo as a coda, but I'm working in the period from Dante to Milton, and the reflection, the work I've been doing in translating Haroldo has proved very, hopefully, at least at the theoretical level now, very fruitful for me in my dissertation project. And on the last note, I'm really curious to be part somehow. I'm really willing to continue this, to explore this relationship between Haroldo and Dante and the Italian tradition in general, and Dante in particular. And of course, I'm thinking of A Macchina do Mundo, Repensada, who, a poem written in Portuguese and in using the Dantean metrical form really calls for like an engagement from Italian critics and Italian readership. So again, I cannot say it's a project, but like it's definitely in my mind to go on and work on that. So thank you.
Thank you. It's really nice to listen about these projects, and I think so. Listening all these presentations, we have a so consistent group of research. So, but we will stay with Giacomo, because Giacomo, you read the Yasmin Vrobe's presentation, right?
Correct. Yeah. So with me, but. Yeah, so I'm starting with the title, sent to me by Jasmine. Topographies of the 20th century, the memorial poetics of stumbling in Haroldo de Campos Galaxia. Dear David, dear Eduardo, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this Haroldopedia adventure with kaleidoscopic perspectives on his so multifaceted work. Secondly, I have to apologize for my, at least, virtual absence. I am attending a conference in Germany that was planned beforehand, and I'm very sorry to miss this opportunity to see you and discuss with you. In the following, I will present some thoughts on my article for David's and Eduardo's book project. The article is part of my homonymous study, Topographies of the 20th Century, the Memorial Poetics of Stumbling in Haroldo de Campos Galaxias, published in 2020. In Galaxias, Brazilian poet Haroldo de Campos' main work, written between 1963 and 1976, he presents 50 multilingual neo-Baroque fragments, each blurring the border between prose and poetry. The text stands in the tradition of word poems like Dante's Divina Commedia or Ezra Pound's The Canto. My article can be understood as an attempt at a rereading of Galaxias a work that has been discussed primarily in relation to concrete poetry and Latin American neo-Baroque literature, asking in how far the 50 multilingual fragments can be read as a poetic testimony of the 20th century. In this sense, my article follows on from studies that have highlighted the relevance of historical referentiality in the Galaxias, such as those by Luis Costa Lima, Kenneth Jackson, Marcio Seligman Silva, and Adam Shalhoub. Related to this is the question in what way the references to traumatic historical events, especially the Shoah, but also the Spanish Civil War, the Vietnam War, or of course, the military dictatorship in Brazil, manifest themselves in the neo-Baroque textual arabesque. In relation to the particular textual materiality of the galactic fragments, I defend the hypothesis that these references are embedded as textual stumbling stones in the Galaxia's text architecture, while linking this conceptual metaphor to German artist Gunther Demnich's memorial project, Stolperstein. Understanding this form of mental stumbling as a memorial praxis, I aim to show in how far the stumbling stones provoke moments of intellectual pausing in midst of the neo-Baroque and, at the first glance, seemingly auto-referential text flow of Galaxias. By means of the stumbling moment in the text, its surface begins to crack and opens the reader's view onto a referential layer that underlies the textual surface, forming, thus, a textual type of anti-monument as defined by James E. Young. And I quote, "Its aim is not to console, but to provoke, not to remain fixed, but to change, not to be everlasting, but to disappear, not to be ignored by passerby, but to demand interaction, not to remain pristine, but to invite its own violation and desanctification, not to accept graciously the burden of memory, but to throw it back at the town's feet." End of the quote. A second hypothesis, which is linked to the first, is that the poet's first two journeys to Europe in 1959 and 1964, where he passed several months traveling between Spain, Germany, France, and Italy, play an important role regarding the conceptual development of Galaxias. The specific historical background is decisive in this context. Especially the German cities were partially still lying in ruins at the time, and the artists and writers were searching for new forms of artistic language and expression. At the same time, the post-Holocaust memorial work began gradually to take form, whereas in Spain, Franquism persisted. In 1959, during his first trip, Haroldo de Campos met not only the poet Ezra Pound, one of the most problematic literary figures in the context of World War II and European fascism, but also the German composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, whose mother, suffering from depression, was one of the victims of Nazi Germany's eugenics and euthanasia program. In 1964, Haroldo de Campos met the French poet Henri Chopin, who had been deported to a forced labor camp in the Czech town of Olomouc during World War II. Two of Chopin's brothers were murdered by the Nazis. These encounters and the experiences he made while traveling through a still partially ruined, in the case of Spain, still Francoist Europe, left their mark on the poet and on his work. Thank you very much for your attention. I am very much looking forward to seeing you all again soon, hopefully for the book launch. All my best, Jasmine.
Thank you, Giacomo, for reading Yasmin. Thank you, Yasmin, if you are watching us later. And last but not least, I would like to invite Patrícia Lino. Muito obrigado, Patrícia. É grande prazer tê-la aqui.
Olá, Eduardo. Muito obrigada. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, David, Eduardo, for not only organizing the volume, but for organizing this event as well. It's a pleasure to be here and to see you all again. In my essay, Augusto de Campos, a crítica transformada e o ensaio plagiotrópico, I appropriated some of Haroldo de Campos' ideas to create a new type of academic essay, to which I call plagiotropic essay. The type of academic essay that can, along with the spatial temporal modernist evolution of Brazilian poetry, ingeniously position itself before the expanded poem, poema expandido. By refusing, in the words of Haroldo de Campos, the merely temporal linear procedure and creatively manipulating the plurima quality of the concrete poem. And here we see some of the rules that I invented to define this plagiotropic essay. O ensaio ou a leitura plagiotrópica deverá desenvolver sempre desde ou mais impulsos intermediais. 2, apoiar-se nas ideias de universalidade e multilinguismo que guiam o fazer do poema expandido. 3, responder à dúvida das mais céticas através da relação exclusiva, original e híbrida que a análise estabelece com o poema e lembrar que o ensaio expande a natureza expandida do poema. 4, expandir-se até outras matérias quando o recurso a estas matérias for tão ou mais adequado e frutífero do que a palavra. 5, fazer uso de materiais e técnicas visuais, videográficas, sonoras, performáticas ou da junção de duas ou mais técnicas entre as referidas. 6, espantar a leitora durante o processo de assimilação do poema. 7, construir-se sobre o estatuto do insubstituível. O ensaio académico tradicional jamais poderá dizer tão claramente o que o ensaio plagiotrópico não diz. 8, fundar-se a partir do seguinte pressuposto: a qualidade do espanto ou do pasmo define a qualidade e a conveniência do ensaio plagiotrópico. To test and to prove the intermedial convenience of this plagiotropic essay, I analyzed in my essay the two enigmagens by Augusto de Campos, published between 1977 and 1979. Código on the left and on the right, pentexagrama para John Cage. The plagiotropic essay includes, in addition to the text, diagrams, and 2 video poems that can be read as both direct responses to Augusto de Campos' poems and the audio-visual expansion of the very thought on which the essay is based. And here we can see 2 frames of Caudex, the video poem or video essay based on my interpretation of Código. And here we can see 2 frames of Revolution, the video poem or video essay based on my interpretation of pentexagrama para John Cage. This essayistic method offers a background for creation that both transgresses and distorts, similarly to the Haroldian concept of translation or translator, the rectilinear form of standardized analytical and interpretative readings. And I will finish by showing you a recent project that was included in HC21, co-organized by Gustavo, with Raquel Campos and Moisés Nascimento. And this work puts together 20 variations made from 20 passages of Galáxias by Haroldo de Campos, and can be considered a plagiotropic essay as well. And here we can see the 20 of them. They are all, most of them are audio-visual. and they can be done, I can keep doing them ad infinitum. And I will show you variation number 17.
O surdo chegou em casa e a mulher lhe deu um nené para ninar e lhe pediu que desse uma madeira ao nené, e a sogra ralhava com o surdo porque ele não tinha jeito para. E a mulher ralhava e o nené chorava, e o surdo era um homem pacato, el surdo, el cubano. Y le cagó un trompazo en la cara, y vino la suegra y le cagó también un trompazo, y entonces vino el machito del piso de arriba, cobarde, te peleas solamente con mujeres, y a ese también le cagó un trompazo y le que se cayó al suelo y tuvieron que echarle un balde de agua, y vino la cana y el sordo y tuvieron que cambiar un tercio del departamento. El sordo nunca más peleó si era tiempo de Perón, y la mujer del abogado habló con el juez, sí, pero nunca más porque no le daban ganas. Y yo no soy hincha de nadie. O táxi parando entre Laval e Maipú, Canhete, eu estava agora em Luna Park, mas ninguém foi vê-lo. La Nación, com manchetes bovinas sobre um gado medalhado, vácuo, vacuárium. Os de La Taquara mataram um transeunte bem na calle Florida, entreveram com pintores saídos de tela, religião e ordem. Uma notícia de nada, radiofoto app para crónica, porque será? El presidente de Estados Unidos paseaba por los jardines con dos asesores, y un nuevo perro en la Casa Blanca sale a su paso, mirándose de la investidura de Johnson, salta furiosamente procurando darle feroz tascón.
This is just an example of the 20 variations you can see, and I intend to do more. I intend to keep making them. All the videos and images you see and sounds as well were made or recorded here in LA. And while I was rereading Galaxies, I also discovered that there's one passage where Haroldo describes the center of Westwood Village where I live. I had never noticed that. So it's perfect that the fact that I record the images, photograph them, and record the sounds here, specifically in this place. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. David?
I also want to thank everyone for the wonderful presentations. It's so great to see everyone. And we do have a question period, although a very short one. And there is a question for Giacomo, which is the following. The Italian poetic tradition influenced Haroldo de Campos deeply, and there are a lot of connections between Umberto Eco's literary theory and Haroldo's poetics. Are you exploring it? What's your view of Campos's translation from Italian?
Well, thanks for the question. Well, I have to say that I started mapping that for myself, because I have to say that this translation, the translation I'm proposing and will be printed in the book, it might first engaging with Haroldo and with his relationship, of course, between the relationship between him and the Italian tradition. So I haven't started, as I said at the end of my of the presentation. I don't have like a definite project right now, but I'm definitely looking forward to as I said, like going deeper in this mapping of these relationships. And of course, my personal starting point would be more on the dancer perspective, because this is where I come from as a student. So I'm sorry, I cannot like answer like directly the question, but I'm definitely taking that into account, especially of course not just in the intertextual relationship between Italian poets and Haroldo, but also, as you were mentioned, like Umberto Eco, so all the theoretical aspect that is definitely a big part of Haroldo's universe, and of course also in his relationship with the Italian context. So thank you for the suggestion, I would say. Sorry, it's not an answer of mine, but thank you.
I wonder if you have any questions for each other, or anyone have a comment or a question about each other. I think it's fascinating that we've had proposals to put all of Haroldo's production together, and particularly the interesting idea of the beginning. And Patricia, you scared us. You've given us a beginning and an end all together at the same time. But so many different interesting perspectives where the post-utopian becomes a plagio-tropicalism, right, in a new setting. If you have any questions or comments for each other, this would be a good time. If not, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to see everyone and to hear all of these really interesting points of view on scholarship for Haroldo de Campos. And we look forward to the book, and we mostly look forward to getting together again at some future occasion, perhaps at a commemoration of the Modern Art Week, if we're ever allowed to reserve space and a date and to travel to come together again. Thank you so much for participating in Haroldopedia, Haroldo de Campos, and International Perspective. I appreciate very much all of your contributions and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.